So ultimately what we're talking about here is this file-based infrastructure. So delivering files, acquiring files, but really we're talking about the back end and storage and management of those files. So what the analysts are saying is that they're expecting the sort of demand for data growth and unstructured data to be about 125 exabytes by 2017. And you'll see that a bulk of that, about 80% of that, is actually driven by unstructured data. So that's things that we really can't predict. Things that aren't typically stored within databases through traditional backup applications. And really the realm of the types of environments that we deal with within the media and entertainment industry. So why is everybody interested in this? Well, this is really a key analysis of where this data is coming from and the growth trends that we're seeing there. So, you know, the addressable market in the media and entertainment space is about $6.1 billion and growing close to 30% year over year. And you'll see other sectors and other demands for storage and other demands for growth in this unstructured data management space. Interesting one is on the far right-hand side, so video cloud. So even though it's a small emerging business right now, you'll see that the growth rates are about 40%, or anticipated growth rates about 40%. So, you know, I think that this slide will start to look a lot different in the coming years as people adopt cloud-based services for large-scale archive and video management. So if we look at storage and preservation challenges, what types of challenges would you face? So, you know, 10 years ago, it was easy to buy, well, a bunch of videotapes, have them on the shelf. People got used to that model. Some people resisted change for a long time. The gentleman from NHK presented that they were really transitioning from a videotape-based workflow into a file-based workflow, and you saw the efficiencies gained there. So, but you know, the demands of things that are changing in parallel. So, you know, the evolution of technology, not so much revolution of technology yet, although there are some interesting things underway right now. Files are getting bigger, you're launching more channels, you're doing more original programming, you're trying to address an OTT marketplace. So, you know, the demands of the infrastructures and the demands of data in this environment, they're growing exponentially. Something that Michelle and team touched on, you know, many different workflows, many different use cases. So this is something that you want to have as a dynamic environment. You can't really statically pick, you know, this feed is always going to go to this destination, because your business might change next year or more quickly than that. Ultimately, you don't want to build another silo. So I think that, you know, things that we've been grappling with in the past, where metadata has been stored in databases serving specific workflows, but without the combination or the capabilities of combining and federating that information to provide a more holistic view. We've seen the same thing on the media archive side. People have built, you know, storage archives for their newsroom system, for their post-production environments, for their play-to-air and transmission, and ultimately no interoperability, no federation, and no sort of economies of sharing and collaboration within those workflows. Something that might seem simple and trivial, you know, everybody knows about LTO, but really about the storage technology choices. There's pros and cons to every different technology, whether it's flash or data tape or optical. Scalability of those services, you know, what do you anticipate your growth over the next 5 years would be, or 10 years? And then the last part, which is a really key prospect, is migration. So ultimately, there are some companies out there that are bucking against the trend of having to migrate storage technologies, but I'll explain why that's sort of a fallacy. This is a key point. So ultimately, when we're talking about media assets, you know, some are very simple. There's an MXF OP1A file. It's a single file asset. So there's a direct correlation. One asset usually equals one file. But NHK, when they're talking about DPX production, for those of you that aren't familiar with the format, DPX is basically an image per frame of film. It's a film format, a digitized film format. A 3-hour-long movie in 3D might be as many as 600,000 or 700,000 independent files forming that asset. Every single one of those is really key to the actual structure and integrity and recoverability of that asset. So the key there is storing that composite asset as an object, as opposed to just a bunch of files with no correlation between them. This is a really key concept of storage and preservation. Obviously, redundancy and content protection. If you are moving from the traditional baseband video or film world into files, you only ever want to make that transition once. So, you know, making the right choices, making the right decisions, and how to sort of move into the new world of files is key. And you never want to go in there with a forklift then and you know, rip out the infrastructure and start again from scratch. It's way too costly in terms of money and resources. This is key as well. So integrating into existing workflows, existing processes that you have within your facility. There's a lot of these workflow type tools which are componentized. You can plug in different connectors and different tools and connect different independent workflows. They tend to be a little bit expensive. You have to bring experts to the table. They take some time to plan and to implement. But certainly that's where we're seeing the biggest evolution of technology and within these media companies, trying to glue together these workflows into a much more efficient, process-driven operations. And then the longer key here is, will I be able to access my assets decades from now, or, you know, not to exaggerate, but centuries from now? All the organizations that are content producers, are content creators, content distributors, all of that content is really the value of your business. You know, you're spending lots of money backing up your emails and backing up your databases and leveraging cloud services to do transcoding and things like that. But ultimately, the vault of your content is the real value of your business. You don't know how your business is going to change over the coming years or decades. But ensuring to some level of guarantee that you'd be able to access those assets is a real important first step that you would want to address. So, you know, this sort of summarizes it all, I think, and we see a lot of people crippled by these decisions. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is kind of talk you through some of the more critical things that you're going to want to look for when you're planning a long-term storage, archiving, and preservation infrastructure, as well as whether you're considering on-prem or cloud. There's services that offer variations of those different topologies as well. So if we looked at, you know, very high level, my perspective on the things that you'd want to put on your to-do list, let's say. So obviously, define your goals and objectives. If it's just simple, you know, you want to minimize the cost of storage, you have a lot of stuff stored on disk, that's a different objective than looking at a long-term infrastructure, preservation play, collaboration, you know, maybe a global federation where you have a bunch of different facilities around the world sharing and collaborating on content. So really understand what the scope of the project is. And that doesn't mean that you have to implement that all at once. It can certainly be phased out over years, starting with your more critical and more relevant problems today, and looking at a more complex implementation. I mean, and certainly MediaCorp is a good example of that type of planning and that type of longer term implementation because of the complexity of the challenge. Pick the right encoding technology. So I put kind of quotations and marks around this because it doesn't really mean codecs. It could mean codecs, of course. It could mean whether you're using DPX or DNX or XDCAM, those type of decisions. But really we're talking about files and data. So ultimately this could be PDFs and Word documents and cover art and image files. Don't make sacrifices at the beginning that are going to end up costing you later. I was in a breakfast panel this morning, and X Factor in the Netherlands chose to implement in SD because the cost of the infrastructure. And, you know, although that might make economic sense today, 10 years from now when they're trying to redistribute content on 4K, it's going to look pretty ridiculous that they're up converting SD for stuff that was filmed today. So making those types of decisions up front, and maybe the SD was a good decision for them, but maybe what they should have done is save some money and at least acquired in HD, processed, you know, and edited and transmitted in SD, but you always have those HD assets then to go back and render against in the future. Be realistic about technology and storage migrations. You're not going to store something on your mobile phone today, and 10 years from now, you're going to laugh at the amount, you know, 128 gig of storage, and you're going to laugh at that 5 years from now. So be realistic about the fact that you will have to migrate, you will have to change over time, and that's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, and I'll explain why here in a second. This is something that really people don't tend to focus on, and I think this is a really important thing, and there's been some very important work in the industry that's helped with some standards around this area, but how your assets are actually stored. So, you know, an MXF file is great, it's on a file system, you understand it, but if you're then taking that MXF file and you're writing it to a data tape, for example, in block-based, that by its very nature is a proprietary format. So are you going to be locked into a specific vendor? Are you going to be locked into a specific implementation? Is there going to be a guarantee that you'll be able to read that data back 10 years from now, perhaps when that vendor is no longer around? So, picking the right storage technology, picking the right application, picking the right workflow tools, but a lot of people are really missing the key piece in between of how that data is actually being stored. And then the ultimate question, to the cloud or not to the cloud? Okay, so something about storage technology migrations here, and this is by pictures. It'll hopefully prove the point. So if we looked at what 10 terabytes looked like in 1998, 10 terabytes today, that's nothing. I mean, the gentleman from NHK, that's, half of one of his productions of one episode of his shows is probably 10 terabytes in size. But that's what 10 terabytes looked like back in 1998. So it was 6,000 slots, Timberline drives, for those of you that have that. This is the Storage Tech Powderhorn device. And I actually looked up the media on eBay, and you can still buy Timberline media. It was basically, for the 10 terabytes, $32,000 if you went and bought it off of eBay today. Well, what does 10 terabytes look like today? Well, it's basically just one single data tape, about half the size of a VHS deck. This is Oracle's technology, the T10000D, 8.5 terabytes per tape, only a pound or so, half a kilo, and about 280 bucks. So that's in about 16 years, 17 years of time. This is accelerating at a phenomenal rate. So, the technology that we're talking about internal to Oracle, the next generation of the T10GAD will be around 18 or 20 terabytes on a single cartridge. That's due to be released next year. So I think that by the time you come back to BroadcastAsia in 5 years, this will have one more exponential leap in terms of storage density and performance here as well. So, what was taking 17 years in the past is by definition taking less than half that time now, and actually even compressing further than that. But that's data tape. What else is out there? Well, people are working on DNA-based storage. So there's two gentlemen at the European Bioinformatics Institute that have actually managed to come up with a scheme of encoding data and DNA using the 4 base pairs. Projected shelf life of more than 10,000 years, which is phenomenal compared to the 20 to 50 years that we're expecting for magnetic media. This is the key one, 2 petabytes in a single gram of DNA material. And there's actually other groups that are working on DNA-based storage today that are getting much, much higher densities than this as well, and much more resiliency. And this actually, this whole entire experiment was independently validated, where they were able to encode Martin Luther King's "I Had a Dream" speech as an MP3, Shakespeare's sonnets. They encoded it. They had an independent lab encode the data into these ATCG pairs. Bases, and then they brought that back and they were able to decode the data. So, the fact that we're talking today about magnetic media still being the prevalent, there's other companies, other organizations working on optical media. The summary here is you will migrate your data. These are the compelling reasons of why you'd want to migrate your data. So it's something that you need to have in your budget while you're doing your TCO calculations, while you're doing your planning for your 5-year or 10-year fiscal plans. You will migrate your data, and there's a lot of compelling reasons why, in addition to just obviously being able to store and protect your data. So now that we're moving, so we've talked about all this great technology, but you have this DNA-based storage approach. How am I actually encoding that data to be able to guarantee that you're not locked into a specific vendor, that you have an open access to your data? So we know that there's a lot of proprietary systems out there, silos, different data formats. A lot of these were actually not done for any reason, but other than the fact that there wasn't any standards built around the way that systems stored data on a large scale. We've had a lot of cases of orphaned archives. If you remember back, there was a company in the late 90s, early 2000s called Avalon. They were acquired by EMC. It lasted for a few years within EMC, and then they eventually killed the product and deprecated it. There was hundreds of instances of this software out there managing archives, and no future proofing, no longevity. So, trying to avoid and making sure that you're not locked into specific vendor solutions is key here as well. And I always, when I'm reading the trade magazines and listening to people speak, to me, there's a lot of confusion around some terminology: open standard, open source. Open source doesn't mean, by definition, sustainable. A standard is sustainable. Open source software is not sustainable. You can download open source software. You can tweak it to your own particular usage or your applications. And then the person that did that tweaking leaves, and all of a sudden you're stuck now with a proprietary implementation based on an open source. So just because it's open source doesn't mean it's free and doesn't mean it's sustainable. So just be careful and don't sort of accept things like that at face value. Open standard, a published standard is something that's maintained by a standards body. It's versioned, it's published, it's accessible to everybody. It's usually license and royalty free. So typically if you're looking at long-term objectives about preservation and storage and protection of your data, you'd want to do it based on standards as opposed to proprietary or open source. If we're looking at the characteristics of an ideal archive and storage and preservation system, these are the characteristics that I would certainly put forth as what you would be looking to obtain or to achieve. So obviously I talked about this: no vendor lock-in, limitless scale. 15 years ago we thought that 10 terabytes was a lot of data, and now, I mean, the systems that we're deploying on premises today are in the 10 petabyte range. So we're at 1,000 times, 3 orders of magnitude larger today than we were just 15 years ago in these infrastructures. And that's without a lot of people doing 4K production. So within the next 5 years, we're probably going to see another order of magnitude change in the scale of these systems. Preservation features. So there's scientists, library sciences people that work exclusively on how to give a higher guarantee or a higher probability of the recoverability of information in the future. So you want to have some of those sort of characteristics and features baked into this ideal format. Object-based, I talked about this before, because you can't always say that a file is an asset. It could be a number of files that comprise a single asset. Storage technology agnostic. If it works today on Oracle T10KD or LTO, then it should also work on DNA-based storage when it comes to market maybe a decade from now. Support for metadata, support for versioning, those are little sort of intricate details, but very important as you're sort of evolving a media archive in your environment. So what choices do we have when we're looking at all of these? So I won't go into all these details, but many of you have probably heard of TAR. It's been around for 5 decades or 3 decades or something like that. It was an open source project. Some aspects of it were standardized. LTFS, open source. Again, it's not a standard. It's just a file system for data tape. And the last one, or the one that's most important and most relevant, is one called AXF, the Archive Exchange Format. I won't go through all of these. I think that these presentations will be made available to you for download. But AXF is actually a published standard by SMPTE. It was published as a standard back in September of last year around the IBC timeframe. It's something that Front Porch Digital and now Oracle, we've been working on for close to a decade now. So it's a very, very important technology. It's a very important implementation. And what it does is it encapsulates all of those characteristics of an ideal storage, archive, and preservation system into a fully described, fully maintained infrastructure. And ultimately, we'd love to come in and sell you a huge archive system. But if we don't keep you happy, you just pull our software out and you put whoever else's software in there that knows how to read and write AXF. And you don't need to migrate. You don't need to be locked in, and there's no risk of loss of your content. And there's a website, openaxf.org, if you want a little bit more information, and the SMPTE standard document is also available at the SMPTE.org website as well, so we're pretty proud of this. Okay, so this is how your data is stored. We talked about storage technology and storage migrations. Now, let's talk about the cloud, the elephant in the room, the elephant in the sky. So is storage, archive, and preservation possible in the cloud? So if we looked at what challenges or what barriers we have, so obviously philosophical challenges, we've always heard that media companies want to hold their arms around their assets. They don't want to have things out in the cloud and out in public. So, there's philosophical challenges in terms of how to bring this to market. Asset security, loss risk, theft. These productions that NHK are working on, they don't want people to be able to hack in and pull out this content. Everybody knows of the famous Sony Pictures case. So, what guarantees, what promises can you have in terms of securing those assets if you're entrusting them to somebody that's not within your environment. Now, in the case of Sony, it was Sony people inside the Sony environment, and that they were still susceptible to cybercrime. Economics. So as you're filling out your huge Excel spreadsheets and trying to figure out the total cost of ownership of a cloud-based services, OpEx model versus a CapEx build-it-yourself type environment, you need to understand the long-term implications of those decisions. So, obviously if you buy your hardware and software as a CapEx, you install it in your facility, you train up a couple of your operators to be administrators of the system, but you still have an ongoing cost of that. You have to continue to pay the company support on the hardware and the software. You have to upgrade every few years because there's a new version of this or a new version of that, or maybe you have some new formats or new devices you need to tie into. So make sure that you're encapsulating all of those in your calculations while you're trying to pick whether it's right to do it on premises or in the cloud. Physical data location. So this is important in some environments where we're dealing with national archives and government agencies that, these cloud services, if you can't predict or you're not able to determine where these facilities are, sometimes they're eliminated just out of nature. So perhaps the Singaporean government wouldn't want to store data outside of the borders of Singapore, and that's a usual request that we have. So being able to have geo-predictable, ideas of where your content is going to be stored when you're engaging with these cloud service providers is a very important characteristic. Long-term accessibility, I guess that one's kind of obvious. There have been, obviously, immature and failed solutions out there, Nirvonics being one of them that everybody knows about. That was 5-6 years ago. Times have changed. There's a lot bigger players now playing in the space, more sustainable. But, there are risks, of course. So if you're trusting all of your highest valued assets out to a cloud services provider, make sure that they're a viable provider. Proprietary implementation. So again, this is back to knowing how your data is stored, knowing how it's stored in the environment is an important characteristic. Onboarding and offboarding. So, we've helped customers that have 10 petabytes of data inside their environment move into the cloud. How do you do that? If you tried to upload that through a wire, it's going to take a few years, even at 1 gig line speeds, even using a spare software and whatever else. So, how is it possible to move into the cloud? But then just as important, if your CFO changes his mind or her mind 5 years from now and decides that they want to move back to CapEx, because maybe the government's giving some different tax incentives or whatnot, how do you get your data back out of that infrastructure? So if all you're doing is you're deferring the cost of the capital on premises to do this, just make sure that you have an exit strategy. So, the pendulum will swing in and out. 10 years ago we were outsourcing development, then people started insourcing them again. We used to have the cloud, it used to be called sort of managed services, client server 10 years before that. So there's these waves and cycles, and I would expect that if you move to the cloud, you might want to at least have some protection that you can move out of the cloud if your situation changes. Device and workflow integration, this is a key point as well, right? Of course, you can just sign up for Amazon S3 and just enter your credit card and all of a sudden you have access to tens of petabytes of high-speed storage. Well, that's great. How does that plug into your Avid environment? How does that plug into your Play-to-Air servers? So make sure that the device integration is a key part of your infrastructure as well. Simple storage is just that, simple storage. So you need that intelligence layer that sits above and can connect into your different editing platforms, newsroom systems, Play-to-Air servers, automation, media asset management. Don't minimize that because that's really the devil in the details. And ultimately, simple storage is just simply not enough. So one of the terms that we use a lot in the space is content storage management, or CSM. So CSM is ultimately a content-aware, object-based storage, archive, and preservation solution. This is software running on commodity servers, controlling commodity disk and tape and DNA-based storage when it comes to market, but including all of the characteristics that we talked about before. So leveraging things like AXF, integrating into devices and workflows, tying into orchestration layers, designed by its very nature for big data. So, what all of you should be proud of is before big data was called big data, we were doing big data in the media and entertainment space. Even back 10 years ago, if you were doing a film production, uncompressed SD production, you're still talking about tens of terabytes of data in that production. So we're still orders of magnitude larger than some of these environments where they consider themselves big data consumers or generators. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, you're talking about tiering storage. So you want to move content between different expenses of storage. It's an active archive solution. It's not HSM. I won't go into the details of hierarchical storage management. That's sort of an enterprise technology. But the assumption there is that your assets degrade in value as they age. That's certainly not the case in media and entertainment. An asset I produce today could be just as valuable as something that I produced 10 or 50 years ago. Deep integration with human workflows, business systems, and devices. That was maybe to the point of the Aspera and what MediaCorp's doing there. They're tying together, using technology, all of these different workflows, human interface tools, planning, scheduling, monetization. So you need to tie into your content repository, of course, because that's where your assets are stored. Metadata mining, deep asset analytics. And the key here is that these CSM solutions are available both on-prem as well as private cloud topologies as well today. So I'll go through these quickly because I know I'm running out of time. So when you're looking at this, again, we're content storage management as a service, or CSM AAS as an abbreviation. This is really this value proposition. It's all of this capability of CSM, all of these deep device integration, support for these different formats, but not based in a public cloud solution, based in a private cloud environment. So if you think back to the idea of a managed service, that's ultimately what you're looking at. So tier 3 data centers with hardware and software that's owned and operated by, in this case, Oracle, providing these very, very specialized capabilities for big data storage, encrypted connections, encrypted and accelerated connections to move your content in and out of that, geo-predictable locations, highly secure, again, encryption for data at rest as well as data in transport. Based on data tape, it's still the most economically viable and highest performance storage technology available today. Key is these solutions, even though they're private, are price aligned with public solutions as well. So for the same cost of just simple storage, you're getting this full end-to-end purpose-built private implementation. And then everything, of course, is based on AXF format. So when you decide to disconnect from the cloud service, you can get all of your data tapes or DNA-based storage in whatever the current technology is, so automatically dealing with all of the migration challenges, shipped back to you in an open standard format that you can then implement anybody's software on top of to be able to access that. So very, very high level of protection of your core assets in these environments. So as an active archive solution, as far as Oracle, I'll speak specifically about that. We have 6 nodes of our content storage management cloud solution around the world today. In the next few months, we'll have one here in Singapore as well. So this could be an active archive solution where you're not actually putting anything other than maybe an edge gateway server on premises, and all of your content is being stored and protected with 100% content durability inside a cloud-based environment. Or if you do have an existing archive system in your environment, this could be your business continuance and disaster recovery, where a copy of all of your assets are being stored in there. And what we're doing is we're helping a lot of customers avoid the forklift upgrade on premises. So maybe they have an archive system that's 5 years old. They're due for a tech refresh of their servers and their storage. What we can do is we can bring all of their content into our cloud-based environment, and they can slowly, over the next 12, 24 months, decommission their on-premises storage, scale down on some of their servers, so start to minimize the cost of their on-premises infrastructures and leverage the OpEx model that's available in a cloud-based solution. Simple web interfaces, so search tools, query tools, of course, integration into all the newsrooms, post-production, MAM systems that exist in the marketplace. I'll close out and I'll actually just leave this slide up a little bit so you can look through this. So if you are looking for cloud providers for moving from a CapEx model to an OpEx model with the ultimate goal of protecting, preserving, and guaranteeing access to your media assets, these might be some characteristics that you want to consider while you're out shopping for solutions. So very, very important, and thank you very much for your time.
Do we have questions for Brian? I have a question. Do you have some use cases for how archives are used in the cloud? Is it the DR? Is it the lazy archive that is just taken off premise?
Sure. Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So we actually have two perfect use cases with the entire span of the applications of the technology. So we have one of the major Hollywood studios that's actually storing and preserving their high-resolution assets. So they're actually going back through their film vaults. They're DPX scanning all of the original films from 50, 80 years ago. They're actually storing that in our environment as a full DR. So they have copies of all those assets stored within their presence in LA on the studio. And that content is being replicated for full DR and business continuance inside of our cloud-based environment in the US. We also have another division of that same business using our cloud as a business continuance hub. So they're originating 6 HD plate air channels out of LA. All of the content that's being produced there is being copied high resolution up to our cloud, which in the US is based in Denver, Colorado. And they have a business continuance arrangement with Encompass in Stamford, Connecticut, who's playing out those exact same 6 channels in parallel in real time 24/7. So when the traffic schedule is generated in Hollywood, one copy is sent to the Burbank playout facility, one copy gets sent to Encompass, and all of that content is drawn down from our cloud and played out to air.